But the best guarantee of our security is that people everywhere in the world are allowed to live their lives in decency and freedom, that the knock on the door is not the knock on the door of the secret police, and that in the end, that freedom is what they want in Iraq, what people want everywhere, and what we should be giving to them.
During the Saddam time, the knock on the door was from the security services. But after the occupation, the torture is done by police and security services, which is the state torture, and militias by different groups, by gangs. And nobody knows who is doing it outside the state. But the torture is widespread.
With torture now being endemic in Iraq, this completely undermines any justification for the invasion and any morality for the occupation and the aftermath of the invasion.
We've also identified 2 similar military orders, issued in 2005, which instructed US soldiers on how to respond to Iraqi-on-Iraqi abuse of prisoners. Fragmentary Order 039 stated that
reports of Iraqi-on-Iraqi abuse be reported through operational channels. Provided the initial report confirms U.S. forces were not involved in the detainee abuse, no further investigation will be conducted unless directed by higher headquarters.
And the logs also reveal that the Americans handed over suspects to the Iraqi security services, knowing that torture was endemic. Almost on a daily basis, US soldiers filed reports of abuse and torture by Iraqis on Iraqis.
One detainee was diagnosed with a possible closed head injury, another with a possible jaw fracture, and the third with a possible spinal injury.
Iraqi police and Iraqi army shot and killed a local national. 3 Marines discovered the local national after they heard the 2 shots fired.
Iraqi police beat them. Died as a result of the abuse.
All these reports were marked.
As coalition forces were not involved in the alleged abuse, no further investigation is necessary.
In total, we found 21 ending with that phrase. In some cases, there were investigations into torture, but we don't know what action, if any, was taken against the Iraqi perpetrators.
The US forces infamously dismantled the Iraqi army, rebuilt it and retrained it. They constantly, from 2003 through to 2009-10, retrained, had advisors amongst the Iraqi police. And yet they didn't systematically, regularly intervene to stop what they knew was happening.
Good afternoon, folks. Last week,
during a press conference, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Peter Pace, and the then US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld seemed at odds over what orders existed if US troops were aware of torture.
It is absolutely the responsibility of every US service member, if they see inhumane treatment being conducted, to intervene to stop it.
I don't think you mean they have an obligation to physically stop it. It's to report it.
If they are physically present when inhumane treatment is taking place, or they have an obligation to try to stop it.
They really did not try hard enough to stop these infringements of human rights because they didn't care. And they wanted to let Iraqis kill each other, you know, and the thing, you know, the more Iraqis were killed by Iraqis than they were killed by Americans or anybody else, you know.
Individual cases are reported, the evidence is collected, but there still seems to be a culture of Iraqi impunity to use torture because, as far as we can tell, those people repeatedly using torture are not repeatedly prosecuted.
The Americans made public claims that they investigated allegations of torture in some of Iraq's prisons on 7 separate occasions, between late November 2005 and March 2006.
But the people being held at those facilities were being properly taken care of. They were being fed, they had water, they were taken care of. So no abuse, no evidence of torture in those facilities.
But the data shows that during the same time period, the army recorded 76 separate allegations of abuse of Iraqis by the Iraqi security services in other places and reported them up their chain of command.
I don't think they turned completely a blind eye, but I don't think they made really strenuous efforts to stop it. Either because they did not want to interfere and also because they didn't want to get involved.
One of the ways that the US wanted to hand control back to the Iraqi people was to establish and train new Iraqi security forces. But these were easily infiltrated by sectarian militias with their own motives.
مسميات مكافحة الإرهاب، مسميات الشرطة الوطنية، مسميات المغاوير، عدة مسميات. كلا تغني على ليلى، كلا تتبع حزب معين إلها. ولهذا أصبحت هناك خرق كبير لحقوق الإنسان، لأنه هناك تصفية حسابات، هناك عملية انتقام من الأشخاص اللي أتوا من الخارج في سبيل الانتقام.
In or out of police uniform, the sectarian militia death squads of the new Iraq were responsible for bloodshed on an unprecedented scale. The data shows that the Americans were aware of the horrific level of the violence. Over 32,500 civilians were murdered. The vast majority, found by coalition patrols, were unidentified corpses, dumped often in the river Tigris. More than 10,000 were found shot in the head. Nearly 450 were decapitated. Over 160 were children. A senior Iraqi army officer who wanted to remain anonymous witnessed the horror.
ولذلك تم قتل الناس على هوية، هذا سني وذاك شيعي، قتلهم على الاسم، إذا هذا عثمان سني يقتل وإذا هذا علي شيعي يقتل.
In 2006-2007 you had bodies dropped at up to 100, 150 a day, with drills, bodies floating in the river with terrible signs of torture and killings. And they were done by militias or policemen that affiliated with militias.
Floating in the Tigris, burned with chemicals, body did not have head or hands.
12-year-old male, cinder blocks smashed into his face and tied to his head.
The child was about 6 years old. Several small holes originally thought to be gunshot wounds were holes caused by a drill.
While the numbers of bodies can be counted, there are no reliable figures for the numbers of Iraqis who have simply disappeared. In the Baghdad morgue, there's a missing room. Families whose relatives are missing, presumed dead, come here to try and recognize a body.
صح لو لا قتلتوا الأهل، قتلتوا أبويا انقتل كلهم يعني ما بقوا.
The photographs of 20,000 corpses are kept on file to help people like Athraha Mohammed. She's trying to find the body of her husband who disappeared 2 years ago.
أبوهم هسه أنت قاعد تشوف الجثث محروقة، حتى نقدر نتعرف عليها، صح لو لا؟ إيش نبيك ما بين هذول هو، بس ما نعرفه، شفت التعذيب اللي مسوي بيهم والحارقيهم حارق. زين شلون نعرف؟ ما نعرف الشكل.
Athra Mohammed is one of Iraq's 1 million widows.
وسوى بينا هيك من صغير كبير، وهذول حوابتهم، حوابة الأطفال، حوابة الأرامل، حوابة الشباب الحلوة اللي راحت.
There is no official agency to help people in their desperate search. But given that the US military knew the date, time and location of thousands of deaths, maybe the database could provide some answers and help families discover what happened to their missing relatives. One thing the database does reveal is the greatest irony in America's war on terror: the alleged link between Al-Qaeda and Iraq.